September 18, 2018. As the afternoon sun beat down through the crystal blue Arabian sky overhead, the surface temperature on the ramp at Sharjah International Airport had already reached a punishing 38 degrees centigrade, as the crew of AirArabia Flight 111 prepared their jet for its relatively short round-trip flight south to the city of Salalah in the Sultanate of Oman. These preparations complete and the last of their expected 42 passengers on board, the Airbus A320 assigned to the flight, registered as Alpha 6 Alpha November Victor, eventually pushed from its parking position as stand 6 at approximately 16:16 local time, commencing taxi only a few short minutes thereafter. What followed, in the very short time window it took the aircraft to subsequently reach the departure runway, would retrospectively reveal a telltale story of poor workload management, systemic failure and a glaring loss of situational awareness, which when combined ultimately resulted in the crew of AirArabia 111 successfully taking off, but in the wrong direction. With such screw-ups being extremely rare in nature, not least because of the numerous safeguards supposedly in place to prevent just such an occurrence from happening in the first place, an examination of the circumstances which allowed the serious incident to happen will, I hope, prove as educational as they are fascinating and reveal how, even with the best of intentions, the potential for human fallibility in complex systems is something which we can never ever take for granted. This is the bizarre and complete story of the events surrounding AirArabia Flight 111.
Calling out Mayday.
AirArabia was established on the 3rd of February 2003 by an Emiri decree issued by Sultan bin Mohammed al-Qasimi, ruler of Sharjah, taking to the skies for the first time in October of the same year, thereby becoming the first low-fares airline in the Middle East. Although the airline is based in Sharjah, its wider operation spans multiple bases across not only the United Arab Emirates, but also Morocco and Egypt, serving over 100 destinations across the Middle East, Africa, Asia and Europe, with an all-Airbus fleet of A320 and 321 aircraft. During the year in question, that being 2018, the airline had carried over 8.5 million passengers, with a total employee headcount of nearly 2,000. Since its modest beginning some 15 years earlier, the airline had grown exponentially from an initial fleet comprising of just 3 aircraft to one of just over 50 in 2018. With such expansion comes huge demands, not least of which is the insatiable need to continuously recruit and train new pilots. And it was in this context that the crew of AirArabia 111 prepared their aircraft for its departure to Salalah. Occupying the left-hand seat was one of the company's more experienced training captains, his experience totaling just over 22,000 hours, 15,500 of which having been obtained on the A320 type. In contrast, his co-pilot was a complete newbie, who, having only recently joined AirArabia as a second officer, and with a mere 160 hours of flying experience in total, was still progressing through her initial line training onto the A320 type. Indeed, such was her level of inexperience that she had only recently progressed to the point where her safety pilot had been dropped. The concept of a safety pilot is one where a more experienced colleague is assigned to oversee the operation from the jump seat at the rear of the cockpit. His or her duty is to provide support to the training captain, an extra pair of eyes and ears, so to speak, during these periods of extremely high workload for the instructor pilot. His considerably greater experience also ensures that should the captain become incapacitated for whatever reason, the trainee's inexperience will not have an adverse effect on the continued safe operation of the flight. As the trainee becomes more confident and proficient in handling the aircraft and managing its routine cockpit workload, the safety pilot will be stood down, as was the case here shortly before the incident flight in question. In fact, this was actually the third of a scheduled 4-day series of flights where the trainee had been rostered to fly with this particular training captain without the presence of a safety pilot. The subsequent report into the events of that afternoon noted that pre-flight preparations were completed normally, in an unhurried fashion. In short, Under his tutelage, the trainee second officer was making good progress, becoming ever more familiar with the layout of our new aircraft and home base, Sharjah International. Located 13 kilometres, or the equivalent of 8 miles southeast of the city, Sharjah International Airport operates with a single runway orientated northwest-southeast and is designated as runway 3012. At just over 4,000 metres, the equivalent of 13,300 feet long, and 60 metres wide or 197 feet, the runway can be entered full length from either end or alternatively from one of 5 intersections dotted along its length, with the very existence of these intersections to play a significant role in the events which were about to follow. During the months of August and September that year, with runway 30 being the active, 86% of all AirArabian departures left from intersection Bravo 14, with only 14% thus selecting to use the full length of the runway. The thresholds at both ends of the runway are displaced by 300 metres, or 985 feet. What this means is that although the aircraft cannot use this portion of the paved surface to conduct a landing, under certain circumstances, such as commencement of the aircraft's takeoff roll, or indeed on completion of its landing roll and taxi, ground movement over this particular paved surface will be permitted. In either direction, the runway's centreline lights consisted of white lights spaced 15 metres or 50 feet apart. For the first 3,130 metres, the equivalent of just under 10,300 feet, followed by 600 metres, or just under 2,000 feet, of alternating red and white lighting, and ending with the last 330 metres, or just on 1,100 feet, of the runway displaying steady red lights only. Although not authorised for aircraft manoeuvring, beyond the physical end of the runway, again in both directions, was constructed a runway end safety area, 240 metres long, the equivalent of just on 790 feet, and again 60 metres or just under 200 feet wide, the purpose of which was to facilitate an additional area structurally sound and devoid of obstacles, which could support the weight of an aircraft in the event of a runway overrun, either on takeoff or landing, or alternatively, in a case where an aircraft was to inadvertently land short or undershoot the runway. As the runway end safety area is by definition not part of the runway itself, in the case of Sharjah's runway 3012, it was used to accommodate the latter part of the respective runway's approach lighting system. Specifically, this approach lighting was fixed just proud of the concrete surface, straddling the extended centreline, at fixed intervals of 30 metres or 100 feet, with the last or closest assembly to the landing runway being fixed at a 30 metre or 100 foot interval from that particular threshold itself. In the context of intersection Bravo 14, the taxiway centreline which led onto the runway was marked with a continuous 150mm or 6-inch wide painted yellow line, with green lead-on lights being buried into the concrete surface along the length of this line in order to highlight its presence, not exclusively, but more often in times of poor visibility or during hours of darkness. Of note was the fact that these lead-in lights were not illuminated as 111 took to the runway, with the most recent weather report for the airport indicating a surface wind of 330 degrees at 11 knots. It was the northwesterly 30, which was designated the active runway for the arrival and departure flow of traffic into and out of Sharjah that afternoon. And this simple fact would become hugely significant. Given that this was the trainee second officer's first time to Salalah, the training captain believed that it would be of greatest benefit if he were to nominate her as the pilot flying for the outbound sector. He articulated that they would start the left engine number 1 on pushback and commence taxi in this configuration. During taxi to the active runway, his intention would be to start the second right-hand engine. This single-engine taxi procedure is common with many operators across the globe, being a commercial decision to save on fuel burn. Furthermore, as part of our overall training experience, he also suggested that if the option presented itself, she would practice a rolling takeoff. Rolling takeoffs are, as the name suggests, accomplished where the aircraft's taxi into an alignment with the active runway immediately leads to commencement of the takeoff roll, without the aircraft being brought to a stop. Such a manoeuvre is advantageous in mitigating against both the possibilities of engine compressor stall in strong crosswind conditions and the potential ingestion of any foreign object debris which may be lying on the runway surface. Again, an altogether routine practice conducted by operators the world over, day in, day out. As the final load and balance information arrived into the cockpit, the paperwork indicated that given the relatively light passenger load, the 320's expected takeoff weight would be only slightly over 56,500 kilos, the equivalent of 124,500 pounds. This figure being inclusive of 10,000 kilos or 22,000 pounds of jet fuel. That being the case, the commander set about instructing his trainee on the methodology involved in calculating the aircraft's takeoff performance. As I've done in many of my previous videos, it might be worth referring back to the general lift equation here in order to put this takeoff performance into context. Lift can be expressed mathematically as a function of density, airspeed, wing area and angle of attack. With the given flap setting for takeoff, this essentially means that at a specific speed, rotation of the aircraft to a fixed attitude will result in enough lift being generated in order to get the aircraft airborne. The question to be answered now is, what is that speed? This speed is one of three separate calculations the crew will carry out once the takeoff weight of the aircraft is finally known. The first of these is the decision speed, V1. This stipulates the speed above which a safe rejection of the takeoff roll is impossible. The second is VR, the speed at which the pilot will initiate this rotation or pitch change, thereby increasing the aircraft's angle of attack. And finally V2, the safe climb-out speed. In the case of AirArabia 111, these speeds were calculated as 122, 127 and 129 knots respectively, for the given takeoff flap setting of 1 plus F. This configuration providing for 18 degrees of leading edge slat extension with a simultaneous 10 degrees of trailing edge flap extension. The resultant engine power needed to accelerate the aircraft to these speeds must be sufficient to reach the decision speed V1 early enough that should an engine failure occur at the most critical moment, a successful rejection can be accomplished on the remaining runway. Alternatively, were the takeoff to be continued on the remaining engine, per regulation, all obstacles in the takeoff path must be cleared by a minimum of 10 metres, or the equivalent of 35 feet. Using the maximum takeoff power available, toga power, would in most cases exceed these requirements by quite a bit, and certainly in this instance with the aircraft being as light as it was. Thus, the last part of the takeoff performance calculations is to calculate an appropriate reduction in takeoff power, a compromise if you like, which will still ensure compliance with the regulatory performance requirements, while at the same time reducing as much wear and tear on the engines as possible. This power reduction is known as flex power. With all the necessary performance data having now been entered into the aircraft's flight management computer, the crew completed their before start checklist and called the ground controller for permission to push. Permission which was given shortly after 16:16 local time.
Arabia 111, push and start approved from stand 6, face to the east.
As the aircraft pushed in preparation for its taxi to runway 30, per their original plan, the commander started engine number 1. Having waved off the ground crew, in calling for taxi, the commander specifically requested a clearance to proceed to one of the aforementioned runway 30 intersections, namely Bravo 14.
Arabia 111, requesting taxi Bravo 14, thank you.
Bravo 14 lies approximately 1,000 metres or 3,300 feet short of the runway 30 threshold, with a departure from here still facilitating over 3,000 metres or 9,800 feet of a takeoff run. More than sufficient for the requirements of Arabia 111, given its relatively light weight. The commander's reasoning was that the intersection departure would save a little time and fuel. The ground controller accommodated his request.
Arabia 111, runway 30, taxi Alpha and Alpha 14, at the holding point contact tower.
With the captain correctly reading back the instructions he'd been given. As she released the aircraft's parking brake, the trainee's second officer in the right-hand seat gently applied power to the number 1 engine and the aircraft began to slowly move forward. It's important to note that the physical distance from the aircraft's partner position to the Bravo 14 intersection is relatively short. As such, the commander wasted no time once the taxi had commenced in starting the number 2 engine, a process which was completed a mere 48 seconds later, just 2 minutes and 9 seconds before the aircraft arrived at the Bravo 14 holding point. The second officer set the parking brake, and as the commander called the tower as instructed, the crew completed the before takeoff checklist down to the line, with the last few outstanding items, those below the line, being deferred until takeoff clearance had been received.
Good afternoon, Tower. Arabia 111, Bravo 14, ready for departure.
Just 3 seconds later, the tower controller responded.
Arabia 111, Sharjah Tower, runway 30, Bravo 14, 1, 32010, cleared for takeoff.
With the captain acknowledging in turn the takeoff clearance he had just received.
Cleared for takeoff, Bravo 14, runway 30, Arabia 111, thank you.
Per procedure, the second officer in the right-hand seat then called for the remainder of the before takeoff items to be completed, with the commander selecting the auto brakes to maximum for use in any potential rejected takeoff, while she released the parking brake and began to move the aircraft forward with idle power towards the active runway. What's critically important to understand in the context of what's about to happen to Arabia 111 is the fact that the commander had still not fully actioned all of the outstanding items of the before takeoff checklist, and was thus, by his own admission, distracted as the second officer entered the runway and turned the aircraft to the right instead of to the left, thus aligning it with runway 12 rather than the reciprocal and intended takeoff runway, that being runway 30. Coincidentally, at about this time, Air Blue Flight 213, bound for Islamabad in Pakistan, which was taxiing some distance behind Arabia 111, reached intersection Bravo 20 and was instructed by the ground controller to hold short of the active runway and monitor the tower frequency.
Air Blue 213, hold short of runway 30 and monitor the tower on 118.60.
From their position at Bravo 20, the crew of Air Blue Flight 213 would have had a clear unobstructed view of Arabia 111 as it entered the runway at Bravo 14. But, assuming that they had seen the aircraft turn in the wrong direction, regrettably said nothing which may have alerted all concerned to the unfolding events. As the second officer turned 111 to align the aircraft with the centre line of runway 12, she applied a nose-down side-stick input of 8 degrees while simultaneously advancing both thrust levers into the reduced power or flex detent as the 320 began to accelerate in the wrong direction. In his subsequent statement to the investigation team, the captain stated that at the time, still busy with completing the outstanding items of the before takeoff checklist, he simply hadn't noticed what was happening and was only alerted to the situation with the second officer's exclamation that the FMA didn't appear correct. On the Airbus types, the FMA or flight mode annunciator is a depiction across the top of the primary flight display, indicating the current active or armed autopilot and or flight director modes. On any given takeoff, the lateral mode of the FMA defaults to runway, once the pilot advances the thrust levers to either the toga or flex detents. That is, if the crew actually take off from the same runway which was previously entered into the flight management computer. Otherwise, the runway lateral mode simply won't engage. In aligning the aircraft with the reciprocal of the runway selected in the flight management computer, as the second officer advanced the thrust levers to the flex detent, this is exactly what happened. She had articulated her surprise at the failure of the runway lateral mode to engage, but in the heat of the moment couldn't rationalise what had caused the discrepancy, nor appreciate the significance of what the subtle change in display was trying to communicate to her. They were now taking off in a direction other than the one that they had told the navigation computer they would be, and it was now understandably confused. As 111's ground speed approached 30 knots, both engines stabilised at the anticipated flex value of 87% N1, this being a measurement of power output and indicative of how fast the engine's low-pressure compressor was actually rotating. Slowly catching up with events and having finally completed all the outstanding items of the before takeoff checklist, the captain picked up on his second officer's confused and ambiguous comments in relation to the FMA display. It appears that almost instantaneously, unlike his trainee, he had appreciated the gravity of the situation and the fact that the aircraft was now accelerating in the wrong direction, rapidly running out of the little runway which still stretched out ahead of the aircraft. With absolutely no time available to fully absorb and process what was happening, he was forced to make a snap decision. Should he attempt to stop on the little runway which remained, or alternatively push on, in the hope that again, with the limited concrete available, he might still be able to safely get the aircraft into the air? In his own words, he later described seeing the end of the runway coming. So he intervened and immediately pushed the 320's thrust levers as far forward as they could go, all the way to the toga detent, as the engine spooled up still further from 87 to 94.4% N1. In a flash, the decision had been made. They were going, but in doing so, the captain had now committed himself to a completely improvised manoeuvre, and the potential consequences of him getting it wrong were huge. In such scenarios where the captain deems it necessary to intervene and take control of the aircraft from his junior colleague, particularly in the context of a training flight, the prescribed procedure is for him to simultaneously press the takeover push button on his side stick, while articulating his intention through the phrase, "I have control." In this instance, however, most probably as a result of being startled by the unexpected rapidly changing circumstances, the captain had in fact done neither, and as such, instead of isolating any potential inputs being made by the second officer on her side stick, both his inputs and hers were now being added together. In effect, both were now flying the aircraft at the same time, a fundamental no-no in the context of Airbus fly-by-wire philosophy. 18 seconds after the 320 had commenced its ill-fated takeoff roll, the tower controller had finally picked up on the fact that the aircraft was heading in the wrong direction and attempted to contact the crew without eliciting any response.
Arabia 111, tower.
The 320 was now passing through 106 knots and still accelerating. At about this time, the captain had reached across the centre pedestal and, grabbing the flap lever, unilaterally reselected the takeoff setting from the current 1+F configuration, upon which they had based all their original performance calculations, to the flap 2 configuration, again completely improvising for the changing circumstances. With the flap 1+F configuration, the wing's leading edge devices had been extended to 18 degrees, while simultaneously the trailing edge devices had been extended to 10. Moving the lever to the number 2 position would now further extend the leading edge by another 4 degrees to 22, while at the same time further extending the trailing edge to 15 degrees. An explanation for what he was trying to achieve with the reselection of the flaps can once again be found within the general lift equation. As we have seen many times before, lift can be expressed mathematically as being equal to a half rho v squared SCL. In this instance, with S referring to the overall area of the wing, with the flaps initially set to the 1+F configuration, the crew had evaluated that a speed, or V value of 127 knots, would be necessary in order to get airborne, given the aircraft's current weight. With his action of extending the flaps further and thereby effectively increasing the area of the wing, the captain correctly surmised that in order to produce the same amount of lift, as the value of S increased, then the required value of V would correspondingly decrease. Thus he would need less than the original 127 knots in order to get airborne safely, a factor which would very much work in his favour given the limited runway remaining. However, that said, the fact that he had not actually conducted any pre-departure performance evaluation for a takeoff from runway 12 with the configuration 2 flap setting meant that the magnitude of speed reduction he had managed to engineer was complete guesswork. And in this context, getting the numbers wrong and attempting to get airborne too early was every bit as dangerous, if not more so, than potentially running off the runway's end. As the aircraft speed increased through 122 knots, the captain began to apply a nose-up input of just over 8 degrees on his side stick, while the second officer, now traumatised by unfolding events, had continued to maintain the initial 3-degree forward input she had made on hers. an input which technically she should have released completely as the aircraft accelerated through 100 knots. Their conflicting control inputs, his 8 degrees up, hers 3 degrees down, although combining to dampen the aircraft's rotation, thankfully was not sufficient to completely stop it altogether. And as such, the 320's nose gear gently started to lift off the runway's paved surface. At this exact moment, another crew also working the tower frequency, on witnessing the unfolding events, had also tried to intervene and highlight the issue.
Tower, we have an aircraft on runway 12. Just to confirm, we are to continue to Bravo 14.
This was the crew of AirArabia Flight 189, still some way back in the taxi queue of aircraft for departure, having seen their company colleagues up ahead commence their takeoff roll from runway 12. The crew of Flight 189, still taxiing for an expected departure from runway 30, now queried the controller as to which runway was actually in use. 2 seconds later, with 111 slats and flaps reaching their configuration 2 positions of 22 degrees and 15 degrees respectively, the aircraft accelerated through its initial rotation speed of 127 knots, as its body attitude continued to increase. 2 seconds still further and accelerating through 132 knots. The main gear lifted off the runway at a point some 30 meters or 100 feet beyond the end of the runway 30 threshold, but still nonetheless on the paved runway end safety area. In reply to Arabia 189's previous call, the tower controller had instructed the crew to stand by. Now, having seen 111 lift off in the wrong direction, as the aircraft climbed through 140 feet, he once again attempted to make radio contact.
Arabia 111, Sharjah Tower.
This time, with the jet now passing through 250 feet, the captain responded.
Arabia 111, go ahead, sir.
111, be advised, runway 30 as in use.
To which the captain simply replied,
Arabia 111, we recognize that now, sir. We will maintain runway heading and level off at 2000.
Which was the standard practice for all departures from Sharjah, until radio and radar contact could be established with the controllers at their larger neighbour, Dubai International. Subsequently, the tower controller handed the aircraft off to the Dubai departure frequency at 16:27 and 30 seconds, a mere 1 minute and 39 after this bizarre sequence of events had begun. Under the supervision of local air traffic control, Arabia 111 proceeded along its planned routing south through Saudi and Omani airspace towards its destination Salalah, with the captain finally handing back control to a second officer. The remainder of the flight proceeded without further incident, with 111 finally arriving in Salalah at approximately 18:15 local time, almost an hour and 50 after its departure from Sharjah, with none of the 42 passengers on board any the wiser of exactly just how close they had come to being unwitting participants in a serious aviation accident. Now parked at the main terminal with all passengers disembarked, the captain was contacted directly by senior personnel from AirArabia's Ops Control Centre back in Sharjah to advise him of developments back home. During the call, it was brought to his attention that in getting airborne from runway 12, his aircraft had struck part of the reciprocal runway 30 approach lighting system, with a standard post-incident runway inspection having found that a steel 70cm or 28-inch high support post for one of the lights had been completely ripped from the ground and destroyed. There was a suggestion from the company representative that given the circumstances it might be preferable to cancel the return sector and instead position the crew home by alternative means. Having visually inspected the 320 himself and finding no obvious damage, the captain however ultimately dismissed the suggestion and proceeded to prepare his aircraft for its return leg to Sharjah as scheduled. However, what the captain had failed to notice, most probably because the area concerned was in direct contact with the ground, was a deep cut into the inboard sidewall and thread of the tyre of the number 3 wheel on the right-hand main landing gear. Although the tyre had obviously remained inflated, the damage was significant enough that rightly it should have grounded the aircraft until its replacement. And so, damaged and all as it was, The return flight eventually departed Salalah without incident, with the captain this time at the controls as pilot flying. The captain and a second officer had been rostered together for a combined 4-day series of duties from what was their home base. They had already completed 4 sectors in total over the previous 2 days of September 16th and 17th, thus making the incident flight the 5th sector they had operated together. Of significance was the fact that of those previous 4 sectors, the trainee second officer had been the nominated pilot flying for the 2 departures from Sharjah, both of which had likewise been from intersections, but in each case not from Bravo 14 and runway 30, as was the case with the incident flight, but rather from intersection Bravo 6 and runway 12. The reason why this is noteworthy is the fact that an aircraft lining up at Bravo 6 for an intended departure from runway 12 will make a right turn on entering the runway in order to align itself with the correct orientation for departure from the southeasterly runway. Although impossible to prove categorically, the investigation team believed that it was possible that the second officer may have been subsequently predisposed to making a right turn on entering the runway at Bravo 14, given our recent experience of departure from runway 12, her general unfamiliarity with the airport layout, and potential tunnel vision with trying to master the complexity of taxiing an A320, which was, for her at least, given her overall level of experience, still not an intuitive act. Regardless, given the fact that she was so inexperienced, this fact alone mandated that she should have been supervised a lot closer than she actually was, and as an instructor, this fact should not have been lost on the captain. So why hadn't his supervision been up to the standard that it should have been? In attempting to answer this question, it's important to look closely at cockpit workload in the 2 minutes and 57 seconds it took the 320 to reach intersection Bravo 14, once it had commenced taxi at 16:20 and 55 seconds. Given the fact that the 320 burns approximately 360 to 400 kilograms of fuel per hour while manoeuvring on the ground, this 3-minute taxi from the gate to the runway was in all likelihood going to consume no more than approximately 18 to 20 kilograms of fuel. Thus, the commercial savings to be achieved in delaying starting of the second engine were in reality minuscule and largely insignificant. What wasn't insignificant, however, was the resultant increase in cockpit workload which the captain's decision had created. Such was the relatively close proximity of the parking ramp to the departure runway that the captain had been forced to start the second engine almost immediately, a process which had ultimately took 48 seconds to complete, and while this process was underway, none of the other pre-departure tasks, most notably completion of the before takeoff checklist, could be undertaken. Furthermore, the 320's Flight Crew Operations Manual mandates that a warm-up idling of the engine for 2 minutes is required before advancing to any higher power setting, in order to mitigate against potential thermal shock. The captain's intention to do this in the limited time available following the second engine's start would be somewhat challenging. Given this fact, and considering the identifiable increase in cockpit workload, bad and all as the situation would have been had Arabia 111 been taxiing for a full-length departure off runway 30. But the captain had deliberately asked for permission to depart from intersection Bravo 14, putting unnecessary additional pressure both on himself and his brand new co-pilot. This was mismanagement of his time, plain and simple, unwittingly setting the stage for a serious screw-up which was completely of his own making. So as 111 eventually received line-up clearance from Bravo 14, the captain's belated execution of the outstanding before takeoff checklist items impacted negatively on his ability to monitor closely the actions of his subordinate, and given the fact that she had been previously coached that she was to complete a rolling takeoff for the practice, that's exactly what she'd done. Only the most important person in the whole equation had failed to see her do it. when he, the captain, had finally appreciated what was happening. The aircraft was accelerating through 57 knots. In total, it had taken him about 6 seconds to mentally process what he was seeing: the approximate position of the aircraft, its speed, the perceived length of runway remaining. Then, take over control of the aircraft from his co-pilot, make the decision to continue, and subsequently advance both thrust levers into the toga or full power detent. His decision to take control of the aircraft, per well-documented procedure, required that he articulate clearly this fact by stating, "I have control." In response, his second officer was thus obliged to relinquish control with her declaration, "You have control," a simple yet effective means of eliminating any possible confusion or ambiguity as to who was really piloting the aircraft. Furthermore, having made the decision to continue the takeoff, the captain was likewise expected to verbalise this fact as well, so that all on the flight deck were collectively aware as to what was transpiring. From post-incident interviews with the crew, however, it became apparent that none of these calls were actually made, most probably because of the cognitively startled state of both pilots. But had his assessment been correct, and his decision to continue the takeoff been the right one? His decision had been based on the perception that the remaining runway he could see ahead of him was insufficient to bring the aircraft successfully to a halt. This, the investigators surmised, may have been due in part to the observable touchdown and threshold markings of runway 30 rapidly approaching. But in reality, there was still a considerable length of concrete beyond that, which could have been used to stop safely if required. In making the right-hand turn from Bravo 14 to line up on runway 12, the paved surface we're talking about between the aircraft and the threshold of the reciprocal runway 30 equated to approximately 700 metres, the equivalent of 2,300 feet. Given that this threshold was displaced by 300 metres, or 980 feet or thereabouts, and the presence of a 240 metre or nearly 800 foot runway end safety area, meant that the captain actually had in reality just over 1,200 metres, or the equivalent of about 4,000 feet at his disposal. Small as this figure appears at first glance, subsequent reconstruction of the events in a full flight simulator proved consistently that what he had was in fact more than he actually needed. These simulator trials conclusively showed that had the captain initiate stopping actions with the aircraft accelerating through 57 knots, that being the instance he recognised that they were facing the wrong direction, the aircraft would have stopped well before even the threshold of runway 30, by a not insignificant amount of 350 metres or the equivalent of 1,100 feet. Even had he delayed, understandable given his startled state, and initiated the stopping actions at 100 knots, the point at which by definition the aircraft enters the high-speed regime of the takeoff roll, tests showed that with spoiler deployment, max engine reverse, and maximum auto brake activation, the aircraft would still have come to a full stop on the paved surface. Admittedly, it would have crossed the threshold of runway 30, but would have stopped short of the runway end safety area by some 50 metres or 165 feet. What the simulator reconstructions, however, also highlighted was the fact that those items of the before takeoff checklist which remained outstanding as 111 began to line up should have been completed in no more than about 10 to 12 seconds. Yet, having received line-up clearance in reality, a full 73 seconds had elapsed before the second officer had advanced the thrust levers to the takeoff power setting. Undoubtedly, the necessity to complete these actions had been a distraction, but given that the combined tasks should only have taken a brief 10 seconds or so to complete, what had the captain been doing for the remaining minute or so before the takeoff was initiated? Was it a case of sheer inefficiency, additional preoccupation with something other than the checklist, or even the possibility of subtle incapacitation? These questions are rhetorical, for although the investigation team acknowledged this shortcoming, their final report failed to draw any definitive conclusions. Undoubtedly, the late visual perception that the aircraft had been aligned with the wrong runway had surprised both crew members. Yet in continuing with the flight to its original destination and returning, the captain had inadvertently allowed the cockpit voice recorder tapes to be overridden, depriving the investigation team of any data relating to cockpit conversations, data which could have provided valuable clues as to the crew's psychological condition and how this may have impacted on their performance. In this context, the captain had described the co-pilot as being startled and frozen. The degradation of her overall awareness had led her to maintain an inappropriate nose-down input on her side stick all the way through the aircraft's rotation. Action in itself, which would not have been consequential had the captain followed the correct procedure for neutralizing these unwanted inputs. But again, most probably because of his own startled state, this procedure too had not been implemented. Even having gotten airborne, the whole episode would no doubt have had a significant long-lasting impression on the inexperienced second officer. What had just happened? What was her role in the whole process? Was she to blame? And if so, what would be the implications for her continued training and or even her continued employment? With these questions and more looming large in her consciousness, and undoubtedly creating a huge, potentially dangerous distraction, the investigation team seriously questioned the captain's wisdom in allowing her to continue with the remaining handling duties, including the landing into Salalah. His decision, they believed, was not based on adequate risk assessment of the situation and a full appreciation of his trainee's delicate mental state. But what of all the systemic safeguards supposedly put in place to mitigate against such events happening in the first instance? Accepting that human fallibility will always be with us, and that mistakes are part and parcel of who we are, can technology be utilised in order to compensate for our collective shortcomings? Well, at least in this instance, the answer is yes. Industry-wide, many large transport aircraft are now fitted with a runway awareness and advisory system, also known by the acronym RAS. This system has the ability to monitor aircraft position, weight, configuration, and performance in real time, issuing alerts to crews where a potential gross error is identified. Such gross errors can be categorized as inadvertent attempts to take off from or land onto a taxiway rather than a runway, any attempt to take off from or landing onto a runway which is too short for the aircraft's current weight, or indeed an attempted takeoff from or landing onto an unintended runway, as was the case with AirArabia 111. According to the manufacturer, the system offers improved situational awareness for the crew in order to help lower the probability of runway incursion incidents and accidents, in providing timely oral messages to the flight crew during taxi, takeoff, including rejected takeoffs, final approach and landing rollout operations. Furthermore, Airbus also offer their customers a separate but similar product called a takeoff surveillance system. With this particular system, when the takeoff thrust is set, an alert is provided to the crew if the aircraft's GPS position and heading are not coincident with those of the reference runway, which had been entered into the aircraft's flight management computer during the cockpit setup and pre-flight phase. Or alternatively, an alert should GPS data indicate that the intended runway is too short based on the crew's computed rotation speed, or VR. Specifically with regard to the takeoff surveillance system, Airbus had stated that given the circumstances surrounding the incident flight, a level 2 caution would have been triggered as soon as the 320 lined up on runway 12, with runway 30 having been previously entered in the flight management computer. In addition, the more serious level 3 warning would have followed when the second officer applied takeoff power. This because with a calculated rotation speed, or VR, of 127 knots, the system had calculated that approximately 1,145 metres, or the equivalent of 3,750 feet of runway, would be needed to get the aircraft accelerated to that speed and subsequently airborne. But from Bravo 14, in the direction that they were pointed, only 1,000 metres, or the equivalent of 3,300 feet, actually existed, not including the runway end safety area, and the system would have correctly reasoned that the maths just didn't add up. Regrettably, both RAS and the takeoff surveillance system are optional extras which cost a not insignificant amount of money, and as such, AirArabia had taken the decision not to fit either system to its fleet. But in retrospect, although the crew had front row seats to the entire event from start to finish, there were others on site who had also occupied prime vantage points, from which, presumably, They could have intervened had they observed the scenario unfold. Specifically, I'm referring to the air traffic controller on duty in the tower. So why had the controller's interjection been so late in coming? Despite the fact that he was working both the ground and tower frequencies simultaneously, with only 2 aircraft on each at the time of the incident, and one of those being AirArabia 111, surely it wasn't a case of him being simply too busy to have noticed. The controller later testified that he had had a high level of confidence in the AirArabia crews in general, as they were extremely familiar with the airfield's layout, it being their home base, and thus would have clearly understood that on entering the runway at Bravo 14, a left-hand turn would have been necessary in order to align the aircraft with runway 30. He stated that he had no reason to expect otherwise, and as such his subsequent failure to adequately monitor their progress was most probably influenced by this expectation. However, these facts aside, what the subsequent investigation was also later to uncover was a bizarre set of coincidences which had completely undermined the controller's ability to put any meaningful mitigation procedures in place, even if he had not been victim to his own confirmation bias. Although it's true that the control tower at Sharjah does provide a panoramic, uninterrupted view of the entire airfield, on the day in question, that wasn't where the controller was actually situated. As the main control tower had recently been closed for renovation, on the afternoon of September 18th, the entire air traffic control service was instead being conducted from the standby tower, a much smaller, shorter facility located considerably further from the active runway, directly above the airport's fire station. With no ground radar facility at the airport, all of the above issues would conspire to provide a far inferior view of the world outside, when compared to the view obtained from the tower's primary location, adjacent the main terminal building. Such was the compromised position of the standby structure, that a safety audit of the facility conducted some 2 years previous had identified a number of shortcomings which it suggested really needed to be addressed prior to the facility being used for live operations. In summary, the majority of issues raised related to inadequate surveillance of certain parts of the airfield, with the report concluding that the provision of a closed-circuit TV camera system installed on the airdrome for the air traffic control standby tower will significantly reduce or eliminate the identified hazards. As a result, and to their credit, the airport operator did subsequently install the CCTV system on foot of the report's recommendation. Specifically, 3 cameras were installed. Camera 1 was to cover the departure end of runway 30. Camera 2 was to cover the main apron area between stands 4 and 8. And finally, camera 3 was to cover the approach end of runway 30, but significantly the intersection of Bravo 20 and not Bravo 14. This is incredibly because the original report had not identified any of the runway's intersections as potential hotspots for runway incursions, and thus the need to effectively monitor traffic holding at Bravo 14 had been overlooked. When the investigation team reviewed footage from each of the 3 cameras, the following was noted. At 16:24 and 49 seconds, camera 1 showed Arabia 111 crossing the Bravo 14 stop bar, having received its takeoff clearance some 21 seconds earlier. At 16:25 and 44 seconds, the aircraft disappeared from camera 1's view, with the observer not being able to determine which direction it subsequently turned once out of the frame. The aircraft remained unobserved on any of the CCTV cameras for a full 20 seconds thereafter, when at 12:26 and 8 seconds, it reappeared on camera 3 departing from runway 12. It ultimately remained visible on camera 3 for a further 55 seconds while it climbed away to the south. Thus, despite surveillance from the standby tower having been flagged as an issue of concern and corrective action having been taken on foot of the report, the mitigation measures employed had still failed to facilitate the controllers with an adequate monitor of what was happening on the airfield, particularly around the Bravo 14 intersection. Furthermore, when one of the investigation team physically positioned himself inside the standby tower, additionally he noted that an A320 type holding short of the active runway at intersection Bravo 14 couldn't actually be seen at all, even with binoculars. Despite the fact that the distance involved is in excess of 1 kilometre or 0.6 of a mile direct line of sight, the more significant issue was the fact that a light pole located at parking stand 24, from the perspective of a controller positioned in the standby tower, completely obscured the intersection of Bravo 14 and the runway. In order to work around the obstruction, a controller would be forced to leave his position and walk to the other side of the room if he was to gain any sight of that part of the airfield. So in summary, the controller on duty in the standby tower was slow to intervene because he simply couldn't see what Arabian 111 was actually doing. And with him monitoring that Airblue 213 was indeed holding short at Bravo 20, while scanning the approach path for runway 30 and the arrival end of the runway below it, he simply hadn't been able to leave his station in order to strain his neck around the light pole to get a better view of the 320 as it entered the runway. Ultimately, the investigation team believed that the incident was caused by the co-pilot steering the aircraft right onto the wrong runway during a rolling takeoff. Entry to the wrong runway was due to degraded situational awareness of the aircraft direction by both flight crew members, due to a lack of external peripheral visual watch and runway confirmation, with the controller's ultimate failure to monitor the aircraft's progress being cited as a contributing factor. For better crew resource and workload management, given the anticipated short taxi time, the captain could, they believed, had considered starting both engines prior to calling for his taxi clearance. Indeed, given the relatively short distance from the ramp to the active runway, any economic benefit from delaying the start of the second engine was deemed to be negligible. As such, the investigation team recommended that the operator, AirArabia, improve its single-engine taxi policy so as to take into consideration the anticipated taxi time to the runway holding point and cockpit crew gradient. Furthermore, in light of the fact that AirArabia had previously decided not to fit either RAS or Airbus's own takeoff surveillance system to its fleet of aircraft, the investigators deemed it appropriate to recommend that the operator revisit the issue and conduct a study to ascertain whether their initial decision should be reviewed. AirArabia was also recommended to take advantage of the incident to reinforce to its pilots the significance of flight preparation briefings, positive runway identification, familiarity with runway signage, markings and distances, effective crew resource management during taxi and takeoff, and finally, the importance of safeguarding the aircraft and its occupants when making the decision to reject a takeoff based on low and high speed regimes. It was further recommended that Sharjah Air Navigation Services, under whose remit fell responsibility for traffic control services at the airport, conduct a further safety assessment with specific focus on mitigating the risks associated with intersection takeoff hazards. As an aside and independent from all that was raised in the report's recommendations, AirArabia of its own volition revised its standard operating procedures so that in future pilots would be forced to exercise greater caution when using intersection departures, by mandating the confirmation of runway in use and the intended direction of turn to align the aircraft on that runway, in the hope that such an occurrence will never happen again. Given the extremely light load being carried that afternoon, it's not without some considerable element of sheer luck that the story of AirArabia Flight 111 wasn't ultimately one of death and total destruction. In truth, this could have, on any other day, ended a whole lot worse.